I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm kind of the minority in my world that I really think that the chances of a Taiwan war are low. The way that the Chinese look at this is they've always considered the Russians to be a useful idiot. And if they're thinking of doing something that's going to stir the pot, they kind of nudge the Russians to try it first to see how it goes. And the Taiwan war would fall into that category. So they saw the Ukraine war as a useful proxy. And it hasn't gone the way that they thought. So, number one, they thought the war would be physically easy because, you can walk to Kiev, and the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years. Well, you got to swim to Taipei, and the Taiwanese have been preparing for 45. And so when the war in Ukraine got bogged down, like, crap, assumption one gone. Assumption number two, they thought the Russian weapons were great, so they cloned them. They stole the IP just like they have for everybody else, and cloned $3 trillion worth of them. And they're now having some very, very serious buyer's remorse, although I guess it would be theft remorse. So, assumption two gone. Assumption three is that everyone will just get over it. Well, we now have the most robust sanctions regime in history on the Russians. And it would be a lot worse for China because Russia is a massive exporter of food and energy. China is the world's biggest importer of both. But I think what has really terrified the Politburo are the boycotts. Because here you have private citizens and companies who, without prodding from their governments, have just walked away from, $500 billion of sunk costs. There is no Chinese economic system without international trade, foreign technology, and market access. And the idea that Halliburton has left Russia on moral grounds, there is no moral cover for anyone who wanted to stay in Russia. And the Chinese look at their system like, they were doing a genocide long before the Russians started. This is a country that isn't a democracy. This is a country that cracks down on protesters. This is a country with a horrible record of social management. There's a lot more places for Western ideology to kind of get their claws into if you really want to take it down. And they now know that the West is perfectly capable of doing it. I don't think there'd be a lot. One of the things we saw with the Russians, and when they tried to move away from the dollar and the euro, they went into whatever currency was available. And honestly, there weren't a lot left at that point. But they did put about $250 billion, if memory serves, into the yuan. And then when they tried to cash it in later, the Chinese were like, nope, we don't want that back. And so the Russians have been forced to move back into the euro and the dollar, just do it really quietly because there just aren't a lot of options. And then, of course, they fly around a lot of gold. That's really their most reliable way of getting around sanctions. So there's not a lot of options. In the case of the Persian Gulf, there might be some room there because the Saudis in particular, now that the United States is no longer their largest consumer and no longer their security guarantor, they've been looking for a new friend. The Chinese have come in with a lot of money and a lot of demand. And so the Saudis have done kind of a co-investment thing in industrial plant in China and refineries, just like they did in the United States. And having a yuan trade for that specific sales line, that makes a degree of sense. But keep in mind that if there is a conflict that involves China and the United States, no ships will be coming and going from China. So the Saudis know full well that if you are involved in a hot war with the United States, your tankers don't go there. And so there would be no point in a hot war scenario for the Saudis to do that. Yeah, in a hot war scenario, we are talking about the deindustrialization of the Chinese system and famine within a year, because this is a country that imports 75% of its energy and 75% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. If, I don't think there will be, if we do have a conflict over Taiwan that does involve either Japan, the United States, Vietnam, or India, because any one of them can do this, that is the end of China as a modern industrialized power with over 1 billion people. It's set apart from most of the world's problems. It's the first stop on the shipment route from Persian Gulf to the oil markets of Asia. It's never going to have an energy crisis. And its security issues with Pakistan and Bangladesh, not that they're minor, but they're kind of ossified. And they only are going to boil up into a hot war if something goes really, really wrong in multiple places. So I don't think it's very likely. So the problems of India aren't going to go away. So the digitalization, for example, that you brought up, that can happen, but never for the whole population. But that's okay. If only a third of the economy, if only a third of the population get brought into the modern age, that's still more people than the European Union. And you can have a growth story. And just like the United States and NAFTA, we're going to have to build a lot of industrial plants to replace what we're going to lose from Germany and China. So will India. So that's a growth story too. But India will never have partners. The countries on its borders are either too poor or too hostile. They will never be integration targets. And everyone else is too far away. And the Indians have never been in favor of free trade. So any manufacturing and industrial build out in India is going to be for the Indians, just like most of the build out in North America is going to be for the most of the North Americans. That will limit the quality level, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. So India is India doing things for India based on its own logic. And that is a very good story. But if you think that they're about to become a major global power, no, they never have been because they've been too isolated. So you can have a very strong success story and still be it not part of a global story. Uh, and you're right, it's not a left versus right thing. It's a dictator versus non-dictator. It doesn't matter where in the political spectrum you can. We've had plenty of examples, or it doesn't matter where in the political spectrum you've come from. We've got plenty of examples from across the spectrum of how you just have individuals who have decided that they are the big man. Uh, on the whole, I've been very encouraged by the events of the last year because we've seen in most places authoritarianism has been failing. They can't generate the economic activity past a certain point that is necessary to maintain public support. I think we're going to see some cracks in the Chinese facade in the not too distant future. The Russian system is clearly in failure, and the Chinese system is not far behind. It's not that I think the Chinese system was sustainable, but political breakdowns within Beijing have now reached the point that it's glaringly obvious to anyone who's willing to really have an open mind on it that we really are seeing a system that is in its final stages of dysfunction. There are exceptions. I am concerned about what's going on in Mexico. AMLO has decided that wants to be not so much Nicaragua, but Cuba. No, that's not even fair. I mean, Turkey is probably the closest comparison to what's going on in Mexico right now, where you've got a system that still has all of the trappings of democracy, but you have a leader who's actively trying to break them down. Now, the people are pushing back, and the other power centers are pushing back. And in Mexico, very important here, they have term limits. So we really only have another year and a half of AMLO before we get someone else in. So I'm not hugely concerned. In the case of Turkey, Erdogan totally bungled the earthquake recovery. And that, even odds, is going to cost him his job because looks like we are going to have a national unity candidate running against him. And in a relatively free and relatively fair election, he will lose. Then we got to worry about the new guy because, we don't know a lot about him and he's never been in office before. But these systems are for the first time seeing the free world willing to use economic and security tools against them. That is new. One of the tenets of globalization was the idea that in time, economic growth and integration will force all these systems to move for democracies. And throughout the 90s and the 2000s, there was a lot of reason to think that that was true. And then it flipped in the 2010s. We're now seeing that if the West and the free world decide to weaponize what they have, they can really tear some stuff up. And so I'm not sure we're getting into the Biden administration's idea of the autocracies versus the democracies, and it's a fight to the end. Way too soon to say that that's how it's going to go. But at a minimum, there's a lot of serious thinking going on. And you can see very easily the difference between the authoritarian systems, your Mexicos, your Indias, your Turkeys, and your dictatorial systems, your Russias and your Chinas, where the decision making cannot happen anymore because the information flows to the guy at the top have broken down. In the other cases, you may have egotistical leaders that don't like to hear things they don't want to hear, but they're still hearing it. And so there's a degree of awareness, there's a degree of plurality that does not exist in places like Beijing or Moscow.